I'll give a brief introduction to some of the things that I think are valuable features of Austen's work. I've written a couple of books on Jane Austen. It's one of the few topics in any field that I've written more than one book on. I think basically the only one that I've written more than one book on. I wrote a small biography of Austen. Prior to that, I had written a book on her novels, an introduction to her novels for students. And the introduction to that introductory book, the title is Real Men Read Austen. So I saw very few hands go up when Alvain asked who had watched these films. And I do wonder if some of you men think it a little beneath you to watch something as girly as Pride and Prejudice. Let me assure you that if you get a good version of Austen's films, it's not girly. It's written by a woman. There are girls in the movies. Yes, there are. They're romantic comedies. But Austen is one of the most incisive writers in the English language. She's one of the keenest observers of human behavior in the English language. She's a great satirist, sometimes verging on cruel. You don't get it in the published novels as much as you do in some of her letters, where she would comment on some person she had met, writing mainly to her sister that was her main correspondent, and would say some funny but kind of nasty things about people that she met. She's not a soft person. It's I think I used to teach undergraduates, and I encourage the undergraduate men to read Austen because they really should know the mind of a very intelligent woman, and that's what Austen gives you. The things I want to highlight really have more to do with reading Austen than watching the film, and I think that's true in any writer of fiction. There's a discrepancy between what you can accomplish in literature and what you can accomplish on the page and what you can accomplish in film. Two very different media that have two very different angles to them. You get two very different impressions, even with the same story, the same characters, and it's very hard to replicate some of the genius, much of the genius of Austen when you put it onto film. And there's a tendency to just in the nature of the media, there's a tendency to distort Austen's aims by putting it onto film because you see things that Austen leaves out of the picture, as it were. For example, the very first chapter of Pride and Prejudice is a conversation taking place between Mr. Bennet and Mrs. Bennet about the future fate of their daughters. This is very much on Mrs. Bennet's mind, and she's pestering her husband to go down and meet the people who just moved into the nearby manor home so that one of her daughters can get married, because she figures as soon as they make acquaintance with the young man at the manor down the street, then they'll have a marriage on their hands. In the book, the chapter begins with the famous statement, is a truth universally acknowledged that a man of great fortune is in want of a wife. I'm not quoting that exactly, but in other words, it's a truth universally acknowledged that a rich guy is looking for a wife. Okay, that's not Jane Austen's opinion, that's Mrs. Bennet's opinion, but it's stated as the first sentence. That's not part of the conversation. At the end of the chapter, there's a sentence from the narrator. Within the chapter, it's mainly dialogue between two characters that you have never met before if you're reading Pride and Prejudice for the first time. You don't know these people when you start the novel. You're given no physical descriptions of these people. You're given no description of the setting of the scene. You don't know what room of the house they're in. If they are in a house, maybe they're walking, you don't know. I have some suspicions based on other parts of the book, what they're doing. I think Mr. Bennet is trying to read, and Mrs. Bennet keeps interrupting his reading. That's what I think is going on. But Jane Austen doesn't say that. She leaves so much to the imagination, and that's part of the genius, because at the end of about a 2.5-page chapter, you know Mr. and Mrs. Bennet pretty well. You know some of their daughters, at least from the perspective of their parents, which are very differing perspectives. You're getting characters that are being rounded for you in the space of 2.5 pages of almost entirely dialogue, with no description from Austen herself. I think there's a kind of white magic going on in the first chapter of Pride and Prejudice. It's masterful how she can create these characters with almost nothing, almost out of nothing, and you're off and running. And she doesn't keep up that kind of that minimalism of style through the entire book. When you take it onto film, you could have, I suppose, two characters with no background, just sitting and talking to each other. That would be quite a clever way to open the scene, but that's not the way it's usually filmed. The scene is put into a place. There are things going on. You see the people. You can't help but see the people. Maybe the way to start the scene is just to have the two voices going. I don't know. Against a black background. But then why not just read the book in that case? Why are you watching a film with no pictures on it? Once you put it on film, you've got to have pictures, you have people, you've got faces with these people. And that just changes the way you're responding to and thinking about the story. So again, some of the genius of Austen is just not going to translate into film, but I can give you some suggestions about things that I think are particularly admirable in Austen. And I think that part of my interest in literature comes out of, as Alvain was suggesting, comes out of trying to think through how to read literature outside the Bible with some of the tools and insights that I've picked up from various people about reading the Bible. And so I think that I don't claim that Austen was a Christian. Austen was a PK. I don't know if you know what that is. It's a preacher's kid. She grew up in the home of a Church of England minister. Two of her brothers became Church of England ministers. She doesn't speak a lot about her own faith in her letters. She doesn't bring it out a lot in her novels. But there are various indications that she was a pretty firm believer throughout her life. She certainly attended the services of the Church of England. She had family prayers with her father in her home. That was the atmosphere in which she grew up. Jane Austen was a Christian writer. And I think that's reflected in the way that she writes. I think it's reflected in the things that she writes about and the way that she approaches the topics that she's writing about. But I think that there are features of her novels that I think resemble features of biblical literature. I wouldn't say that these are conscious parallels or conscious imitation on Austen's part, but I think there are these parallels. One of them is the style that I've just mentioned, referring to the first chapter of Pride and Prejudice. Austen was dismissed by the English writer Charlotte Bronte for her miniature delicacy, the miniature delicacy of her novels. Bronte was a romantic writer. You want to have passion and big moments and big speeches. And Austen was just kind of working in this very small space. It's like looking at a Van Eyck painting. I don't know if you've ever seen the Flemish painter, Flemish Renaissance painter Van Eyck. He's got paintings that are about that size, intricate detail on the paintings. You know, you can see the lines in the fur of somebody's coat, the sleeve of somebody's coat. That's the way she's working. Coming from Charlotte Bronte, that's a criticism. I think that's a strength of Austen, and I think that has certain parallels with the way that the Bible works. Robert Alter, a Jewish biblical scholar and literature scholar, has talked about the minimalism of biblical narrative. I mentioned this earlier today when I was talking about 1 Samuel. Very few descriptions in the Bible, even though there's a lot of war scenes in the Bible, there are very few descriptions of the actual engagement of battle or of weapons or of armor. if you want a contrast, again, go to the Iliad, and you can see a dramatic contrast between the interests of the different writers. The biblical writer is not interested in that, and they're not interested in physical appearance most of the time. We know a little bit about what certain biblical characters look like, but many of them we don't know anything at all. And usually when there's a physical description, it has some kind of significance to it. Why are we told that Esau is red and hairy all over? There must be some significance to that. We don't know what Jacob looked like. You think he was smooth. The text actually says he was perfect. He was a perfect man. He was a whole man, a blameless man. That's what the Hebrew word means. Maybe he didn't have as much hair as his brother, but I don't think that's what the Hebrew text actually says. But Austen writes in a similar kind of fashion. As I said, she doesn't have extensive descriptions of settings. She rarely describes the physical appearance of a person beyond a very general description. Elizabeth Bennet in Pride and Prejudice is complimented for her fine eyes. Color, please? Shape? We don't know. They're fine, though. That's about as far as we get. They're fine eyes, but we don't get any more detail than that. She doesn't give us a lot of variety of social settings. She doesn't include a lot of characters. There's a kind of minimalism in the number of characters that she adds, that she focuses on. You rarely, for example, even when you're in Austen's novels, if you're in a great house where you know there are servants teeming everywhere, Austen rarely gives you a glimpse of one of those servants. Her focus is on, as she said in a letter to her niece who was interested in writing, 3 or 4 families in a country setting. She thought that was a perfect setting to write a novel. Because you could get into the intricacies of their interrelationships. If you expand the cast beyond 3 or 4 families, then all the interactions become much more complicated and much more superficial in some way. You can get into the intricacies of human behavior through that minimalism. And again, without claiming that Austen consciously was imitating biblical narrative, there's a parallel there with biblical narrative. That minimalism also enables her to look at the human behavior at a kind of microscopic level. She's interested in manners, not because she's kind of what's the word I'm looking for? She's because she's an aristocrat and she's just interested in everybody living up to the right standards of manners. She's interested in manners because manners are a means of communication. Bad manners can communicate something. Good manners can actually cover over something, and you'll find Wickham in the film. Wickham has a kind of graceful manner to him. His manners are impeccable, but he's hiding something. He's using those manners as a way of screening out his actual character. Manners are a means of communication. Manners are also a matter of behavior and standards in a code of how we treat one another. A lot of them are in themselves arbitrary, but they still have the intention of showing love and respect for the people around you. So manners have a moral character for Austen, and I think that she examines the intricacies of manners and how people treat one another in that kind of microscopic way in order to explore moral issues. Alistair MacIntyre is a major moral philosopher in the United States. He taught for many years at Notre Dame University, wrote a number of famous books, one of which is After Virtue, and it's a defense of the tradition of virtue ethics. Ethics is not just about problem situations and decisions and conformity to rules, but it's about the cultivation of character and virtues. And MacIntyre said that had been lost in modern ethics, and he was trying to recover that. He's got a whole chapter on Jane Austen in that book, because he thinks Austen was trying to express a certain view of the moral life, the virtuous life, that picked up on themes from earlier moral philosophers. And I think that that's another kind of biblical value of reading Austen, that she gives us a way of thinking about life and relationships on this very microscopic level. The last thing I'll point out is the obvious. She writes books about marriage, about romances and marriage. In Pride and Prejudice, she gives us, I think, a spectrum of different sorts of marriage. There are a number of marriages that are actually happen, romances that happen in the story. There's a marriage that begins the story that's already there, has been there for some decades. That's the marriage of Mr. and Mrs. Bennet. They have a certain kind of relationship with one another. And then their daughters are getting married. Some of their daughters are getting married through the course of the novel. So marriage is a major theme, and if you analyze the structure of Pride and Prejudice, you can see that the marriages and marriages and romances and engagements are placed at important junctures in the structure of the story. So it's a major theme. But she presents this spectrum of marriage, I think, in order to get at the question of what makes a good match. Austen herself never married. She came close a couple of times. She had an early flirtation of some sort that kind of dwindled. She had a later relationship that seemed more serious, and then the young man died suddenly, and she lived her life as a single woman. So all of her knowledge of marriage comes from the outside. That's one reason, I think, why she never doesn't take much time to describe actually existing marriages. She limited herself to things that she knew. She didn't know what a marriage looked like from the inside, and so she rarely gives us much beyond the marriage itself. The climax of all her stories is the marriage of the lovers. Trying to show how they live the rest of their lives is beyond her purview. This spectrum has to do, I would characterize it in terms of another Austen book. There's a spectrum between sensible marriages and marriages of sensibility. Sensible marriage and marriages that are emotionally driven. A marriage of sense is a marriage that's calculated, where one or the other partner sees the other as maybe a way out of a bad situation, maybe as a way to survive, purely to survive, have enough money to have a comfortable life. The marriage of sense that we have in the book, in the novel, and in the story is the marriage of Charlotte Lucas and Mr. Collins. Mr. Collins is an idiot. Everyone around Mr. Collins knows he's an idiot. He happens to be an Anglican clergyman also. Austen, although growing up in the home of an Anglican pastor, satirizes pastoral characters on a number of occasions. And some of the most dim-witted characters in her novels are pastors. Mr. Collins is one of them. He kind of is the classic example of an idiotic minister. Charlotte Lucas, who eventually marries Mr. Collins, knows that Mr. Collins is an idiot. But she has no choice. She's aging. She is somewhere in her 30s probably. She has no prospects. She has no inheritance from her parents. And in the setting that Austen is depicting, she really has no options. It's not like she can go get herself a career. That's not going to happen. She can't make her life on her own. She has to find a man to attach to. And she finds a man that she knows is a dolt. And she calculates, this will give me a better life than living out my life as a spinster. I don't think Austen despises that. I think there's a degree of pity or compassion for Charlotte Lucas. She's in a bad situation. The end point of that, the result of that, is a marriage where the two partners live basically in separate worlds. at one point, Elizabeth, I think it's in the film, Elizabeth visits Charlotte after her marriage to Mr. Collins, where Charlotte reveals, without actually saying what she's doing, how much she encourages Mr. Collins to be out in the garden, puttering around in the garden. Why would she want him to be outside all the time? Well, no doubt it's for his own health. It's a good distraction for, no, she can't stand his company. And she wants to push him away into some other part of the house where she doesn't have to deal with him. She doesn't want to have to encounter his idiocy, so she she arranges things so that they're separated from each other. The interesting thing in Pride and Prejudice is that one of the examples of a marriage of sensibility, a marriage of feeling, is the marriage of Mr. and Mrs. Bennet. We don't know that at the beginning of the novel because they're already married and were brought right into the middle of their history. But we learn later from a comment that Mr. Bennet makes that the reason why they got married was because of his infatuation with what he thought was his future wife's vivacity, her liveliness. What he discovered was just her anxiety and nervousness. What's the result of that marriage? That's a marriage that's based just on an emotional attraction, a kind of romantic spark. The interesting result is that the result is the same as the marriage of Charlotte Lucas to Mr. Collins. Mr. Collins and Charlotte Lucas live in separate worlds. Mr. and Mrs. Bennet live in separate worlds. A marriage of pure sense is not not an actual union of souls and hearts, nor is a marriage that's purely based on emotion. Lydia Bennet, one of the sisters, ends up, I'll go ahead, ends up marrying Wickham. Sorry to spoil that for you. Wickham will appear earlier. Eventually, Lydia marries Wickham. Lydia is a valley girl, if you know what a valley girl is. She has very little between her ears. Her life is just one thing after another. She doesn't have any sense, and she's attracted to Wickham because he wears a red coat. He's a soldier, okay, and she swoons over soldiers. So that's another marriage of sensibility, a marriage of emotion. We don't see what happens to that marriage. We can suspect it's going to end up a lot like Mr. and Mrs. Bennet. They're going to end up separated. Wickham, although he's a scoundrel, he's not an idiot, and he's going to get tired of what he thinks is Lydia's vivacity as it turns gradually into anxiety and nerves. Okay? Their marriage is going to end up the same as Mr. and Mrs. Bennet. So what makes a good match? It's not pure sense. It's not pure emotion. For Austen, it has to combine both of those. Elizabeth, spoiler alert, close your ears if you don't want to hear it. Elizabeth ends up with Darcy, okay? Mr. Darcy. You won't believe it when they first meet, that they can end up together. Well, you can't believe it. If you've seen a chick flick, if you've seen a romantic comedy, you know they're going to end up together. Of course, they hate each other at first. They're going to end up together. That's the way these things work. Okay. So Elizabeth ends up with Mr. Darcy. But one of the obstacles in the way of their eventual engagement in marriage is their difference in social status. They're both in upper class English society, but Mr. Darcy is way above where Elizabeth is. Elizabeth's father is a gentleman, but he's nowhere in the same realm as Mr. Darcy. And Mr. Darcy is hesitant about the relationship. Other people are opposed to the relationship because of that. Is that wrong of him? Elizabeth becomes more infatuated, more interested in Mr. Darcy when she visits his home. It's a very, very nice home, a very large home. And Austen tells us that she imagines what it would be like. This is the first time she's been there. She's met Mr. Darcy and they've had a little friction. But when she sees his home, she says, oh, this man has taste. This man has a big house. And she imagines what it would be like to be a lady of such a home. Okay, is that wrong of her? I don't think for Austen it is. Mr. Darcy is right to take the social difference into consideration. It has to be a marriage that makes sense. Elizabeth is right to think, I want a husband who can support me. Austen is so interested in money that some critics have called her a Marxist. I think that's unfair to poor Jane. But she is interested, and her women characters particularly, all men characters boast about their money, but there's a lot of discussion of money in the books. That Austen doesn't consider that beneath notice. She thinks that's an important part of a good match. Because if two people come together like Lydia and Wickham who have no resources, then they're going to not going to be able to have a genuine union of minds. So there's an element of sense that's part of a good match. There's an important element of sensibility that I don't think I have to take time to describe. Darcy and Elizabeth end up attracted to each other. Elizabeth's sister Jane ends up attracted to Darcy's friend Bingley. There is an emotional component to it, but neither of those by itself works. And even combining the two doesn't really work. What makes a good match is a common taste, a union of hearts and minds, a union in which each party, each partner, retains his or her own strengths and character, and yet the strengths and character of each enhance and enrich the other. Elizabeth is much livelier than Darcy. Darcy is never going to be as lively as Elizabeth, but he would be pretty stolid and slow, and if he didn't have Elizabeth around. Elizabeth livens him up. And Darcy gives Elizabeth some stability and grounding that she wouldn't have if she were with another sort of man. That kind of mutuality is part of what makes a good match. I think one other element, and this is an element that one critic points out when she describes Austen's romances as Anglican romances, Christian romances. Another element of a good match is something that's undefinable, that cannot be anticipated, cannot be controlled, and that is something that we could describe as grace. The surprise of finding another person that balances and excites and you're attracted to, and the sense and the sensibility come together. There's always an element of grace that comes from beyond the parties, beyond the romantic partners, that's required for the two of them to be joined together. So with those introductory remarks, roll them.